everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Ann Christiano. I'm a professor at the University of Florida. And maybe we can start just because I know some of you, but not all of you, so it would be great just to know who's here and where you're from. Do you mind starting?
Not at all. I'm Lisa Alcala. I am a mom and a social worker at the PA in the homeless program. And I like words and writing and
Just introducing yourself, where you're from.
Hello everyone, my name is Michael. I'm a 14-year student at UF.
Okay.
Oh, I'm Nicole Harris, and I'm a teacher at Gainesville High School. I'm Alex, I'm a 4th-year student as well.
I'm Matt, I'm a faculty member at the College of Journalism and Communications.
I'm Holly, I'm a 3rd-year student at UF.
I'm Narrate, I work for the HW Alliance and the Florida Springs Council, and I also write the press releases for Santa Fe College's Finance Reform Program.
I'm Jean Crockett. I'm a professor in the College of Education at UF.
I'm Linda Hosky. I'm a retired nurse teacher. Still working.
I'm Maggie Mangrum. I'm a graduate student in the College of Journalism and Communications at UF. I'm a freelance teacher.
I'm Tyler Prana, and I am a global business owner in New York.
Betty Torres, faculty at University of Florida.
I'm Jaron Jones, co-founder of Narrate, and I am very excited to be here. Thank you all.
Taylor, also attended
Then my name is Ben. I'm a 2nd-year student at University.
I'm Olivia. I'm a 3rd-year student at the University of Florida.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. It feels sort of weird to stand in such a small room, so I hope you don't mind if I sit here with you so we can make eye contact. Like I said, my name's Ann Christiano. I'm a professor in the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida. And I got really passionate about stories when I was working at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And I was working on the communications team, and I was tasked by the president of the foundation to go to Capitol Hill and start getting policymakers to understand why foundations matter. And so I'll never forget the first day that I went to Capitol Hill. When I was tasked with this project, I didn't even know who my congressman was. And I guess they didn't know what else to do with me. So I remember going into the Longworth office building and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm in the building. And then thinking, oh my gosh, I'm in the elevator. Oh my gosh, there's a congressman's door. Oh my gosh, my hand is on the doorknob. Oh my gosh, I have to walk in this room and actually make a difference. And I sat down with a health policy staffer from a Republican senator from Oklahoma and started to tell her about the work that the foundation had funded to help people overcome the trauma of the Oklahoma City bombing. And she said, I was across the street that day. And we had this immediate moment of connection where she understood immediately why what we did was so important, and I understood why she valued it. And at that moment, I was no longer afraid to do this project, and I realized that if I wanted to change how people saw something as difficult to understand as an organization that gives away money and why it gives it away and the difference that we were making, that all I really had to do was find the best stories that I could and tell them to the people who would care most about them. And when I came here to start a program in using strategic communications to drive social change, one of the things that I brought with me was this real passion for stories. And the reason for that is that in so many different points in my career, I worked with people who really wanted other people to understand the data around a particular issue. They wanted people to understand the data around health disparities or the data around gun violence. And what my goal became in my career was to get them to begin to tell stories. that, and to try to convince my colleagues that people weren't not acting in the way that we hoped that they would because they weren't aware of the problems or didn't understand the problems. It was because we hadn't given them an opportunity to care about them. And that if we really wanted people to do something, we had to tell stories that would make people care. But I also realized that to build my credibility as a storyteller, I also had to back up my case with some science and to really understand the science behind why stories work. So I could say to my colleagues who were saying, no, we have to talk about the data, and I'd say, well, actually, the behavioral science tells us this. So that's why I got passionate in finding the science behind storytelling, because I wanted to be an advocate for storytelling as a way to help people care about issues. I was also mentored by this man, Frank Carell, who was an extraordinary storyteller in his own right. Frank Carell was a graduate of the College of Journalism and Communications in 1961 and went on to become Miami Herald's first science writer. He hired me early in my career at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and really built a culture of storytelling within the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And he, when he became sick with cancer and was thinking about what his legacy would be, he decided to fund a chair at the University of Florida to begin to build an academic discipline in using strategic communications to drive social change. And so I will never forget the day that I was speaking at Frank Carell's memorial service, and the dean of the college attended that service, and I remember seeing John Wright across the room and feeling just as I did the first time I saw my husband, and realizing that it was time to go to the University of Florida and begin this work. So that's why I'm here 6 years ago. That's why I'm passionate about stories. But my passion for stories is not limited to a personal hobby. Andy Goodman, who is an extraordinary storytelling coach, he was at University of Florida about a year and a half ago, and somebody who's a mentor of mine, argues that stories are the fundamental unit of human communication, that if we are not telling stories, we are not communicating. If we do not tell a story, we have said nothing. And my beloved colleague, Mike Foley, who is a much revered professor in the College of Journalism and reporting instructor, often quotes Tom French saying the stories are like this hunger, this thirst, this burning desire to know what happens next. But I also love this, and this also gets at part of the reason that I've become really passionate about stories and studied stories so much, is Debbie Senzipper, whose recently published book, Love Wins, is a fantastic read. If you haven't picked it up, do. It's a phenomenal page-turner about the fight for marriage equality. But in that book, she says, every social movement starts with a story. So in this historically accurate image that I captured from the Museum of Natural History, used with permission from the subjects, of course, I think I'm probably not the first person today to show an image like this. But one of the things that we know about storytelling is that storytelling was fundamental to keeping us alive. This part of the reasons that humans survived was because we told stories, because we transmitted our knowledge that allowed us to survive through story. So anthropologists have documented this well. We know that because people were able to say to one another, do not eat the red berries because the other guy ate the red berries and he died, that we are all now here to talk about it. But it's also true, Charles Fernahue, who is a neuroscientist and novelist and Scottish, and one of my academic crushes, has written this fantastic book, Pieces of Light, in which he studies the science of memory. And one of the things that he writes about in this book is that stories are the building blocks of memory. And in fact, our brains crave stories and crave narrative at such a deep level that if we're trying to remember something that we know is important and we don't have a narrative to support them, we will create one. And this is one of the reasons he writes that people so often provide false testimony in trials and provide false testimony to police because they know that what they have seen is important. Their brain tries to arrange these things in a way that will make sense. And so if you want somebody to remember what you are saying, you need to tell them a story. Gregory Burns, who is at the Center for Neuropolicy at Emory, has done fMRIs of people both before and after they've read a novel, and followed up several days after, and has found that there seem to be lasting changes in our brains after we read novels. So narrative fundamentally changes how our brains work. Why is that? We don't really know yet. How is that? We don't know that either. But we know that there's something really important that happens with stories that doesn't happen in other forms of communication. And when you start to look at those physiological responses, I ran across this video from a fantastic conference that is by invitation only, and I have never gotten an invitation, but someday, called The Future of Storytelling. And Benny, did you go to Future of Storytelling? Did I hear? Oh. So this is a video that came out of the Future of Storytelling a couple of years ago about some of our physiological responses to stories.
I want to tell you a story about a little boy named Ben. Ben is 2.5 years old, and Ben has brain cancer. And Ben's really happy. He's happy because he's been through 2 rounds of chemo and radiation, and he feels good for once. He doesn't feel yucky, and his father's enjoying seeing Ben's happiness. As the father tells the story of Ben and his cancer, the father's voice begins to break. And he says, it's very difficult to play with Ben because Ben thinks everything is wonderful, but I know something that Ben doesn't, that Ben's dying. And he talks about how difficult it is to play with Ben, knowing that in 3 or 6 months, Ben will be dead. And yet Ben is so happy, he's so beautiful. And so the father tries as hard as he can to enjoy Ben, to be joyful around Ben. But then he says in the middle of this short story that it's an amazing thing to know how little time one has left. And as he says that statement, he has merged himself with his son. It's as if the father himself is dying. So in my laboratory, we've studied this story extensively. What we found is that 2 primary emotions were elicited. One is distress, and the other is empathy. At the same time, when we asked people what they felt after the story was over, we really couldn't get very clear answers. So we began doing other studies on this story. So we took blood before and after, and we found that the brain produced 2 interesting chemicals. One is called cortisol, which focuses our attention on something important. So cortisol correlated with our sense of distress. The more distress you felt, the more cortisol you released, and the more you paid attention to that stimulus. The second chemical release is called oxytocin, which is associated with care and connection and empathy. And oxytocin was correlated with people's sense of empathy. And the more oxytocin released, the more empathic they felt towards Ben and his father. Then we did something different after this experiment. We gave individuals a chance to share money with a stranger in the lab. And indeed, those who produced both cortisol and oxytocin were more likely to donate money generously to a stranger they couldn't see in the lab. In another experiment, we gave individuals a chance to donate money to a charity that works with children who are ill, and indeed, those who released oxytocin and cortisol donated money to this charity. In fact, the amount of oxytocin release predicted in both cases how much money people would share with a stranger or with a charity. What we're seeing is that this narrative is changing behavior by changing our brain chemistry. So we decided to go a little further and ask, could we actually predict before they watched the video who would donate money to charity? So with funding from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, we reran the study in which we not only took blood, but now we measured heart rate and skin conductance and respiration. And using these additional measures, we were able to identify this distress response and this empathic response, and we could predict with 80% accuracy who would donate money to charity. These individuals get paid about $20 to do an experiment, and the people who donated money on average donated half their earnings. So we began to investigate the story further. We used functional brain imaging to identify the regions of the brain that were most active while watching that video compared to a control video in which Ben and his father were at the zoo. What we found was that the most active areas For the emotional story, where areas of the brain associated with theory of mind or understanding of what others are doing, and areas that are rich in oxytocin receptors that make us feel empathy. And guess what happens when you watch 100 seconds of a father and son at the zoo? Nothing happens and people just blank out. There's no reason for them to attend to this information because nothing's happening. There's nothing exciting. It's important to understand that stories have to have this particular structure. 150 years ago, a German theorist named Freytag called this the dramatic arc. So there are particular story aspects that go into making an effective story: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and then the denouement. The story of Ben and his father talking about knowing his son is dying has those aspects. It captures their attention. There's a coming climax. How can Ben's father actually engage with his son in this wonderful, relaxed, playful way, yet knowing that his son will die soon? It seems like there may be a universal kind of story structure. So stories are powerful because they transport us into other people's worlds, but in doing that, they change the way our brains work and potentially change our brain chemistry. And that's what it means to be a social creature, is to connect to others, to care about others, even complete strangers. And it's so interesting that dramatic stories cause us to do this. In these experiments, they do it in a very functional way. People are donating money because they want to help Ben and his father. And yet when we watch other stories or see movies, listen to music, the same thing can happen. We feel uplifted, we feel motivated, we feel connected to others around us.
So I love this as an example of some of the things that begin to happen when we tell stories. And I also appreciate that Paul Zak breaks down some of the critical elements that have to be in a story for them to have that kind of effect. And I recently am a big fan of the newsletter Brain Pickings. If you don't get it, you should absolutely. It's the best part of Sunday morning is when Brain Pickings arrives in my inbox. And she, Maria Popova, who curates the site and the newsletter, recently was writing about Jerome Bruner, who studied how stories affect young children as they develop and how they help us in sense making. And one of the things that he said is that in contrast to our vast knowledge of how science and logical reasoning proceed, we know precious little in any formal sense about how to make good stories. And so here he is from the scientific perspective, saying we should know more about this. We should really understand what makes, from the science behind what makes a story good or bad. And so my colleagues in the College of Journalism and I were sort of fascinated by this question. And what creates these kinds of moments that we've all had where we're up reading by the flashlight, just one more chapter, just one more page, and then suddenly we look out the window and we no longer need our flashlight because we can hear the birds chirping. So what creates those kinds of moments? So we were asking this question recently, and that was, Chan was part of this group, and Benny was involved in it as well. And we started saying, what if we found some of the people who are doing really interesting research who could help us begin to understand the science behind what makes one story more powerful or more memorable than another. And these may not even be people who necessarily see themselves as doing research on stories or narrative, but they may be looking at it from the perspective of neuroscience or psychology. So we invited people from all over the world to come and sit down with us in the college and not present papers, but just to sit down and say, here's what I know about stories. Here's what I know about the importance of empathy. Here's what I know about the importance of a particular structure. It was really fascinating. We had one of the scholars was studies horror films and what makes a particular scene in a horror film more or less frightening based on timing. Who are some of the other people that were with us?
Sorry, we can get too much. We had one, Sarah Cobb, who works with College of War, I think, war narratives and how conflict pertains to storytelling. We had so many fascinating people.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary group of people. Melanie Green, who does research about how narrative helps people make sense of diagnoses and helps them navigate treatment. And so a real range of 11 scholars from a range of disciplines. And there were a couple of things that we took away from that conversation, and we're still distilling it, because I think everybody who left that day, that we just did this last week, so everybody who sort of left this conversation said, I used to think I knew a lot about stories, and now I don't think I know a lot about stories after talking about them all day. But there were a couple of things that we really took away from that. I should also say that those conversations were facilitated by professional storytellers. So we had people from NPR and Fusion come in and really, and Cynthia Barnett, who is a phenomenal writer here, curated and facilitated those conversations. So we learned a couple of things about what brains crave in stories. So I think, obviously, the structure of a story is hugely important. Paul Zak talked about that in his talk, and Alex knows, and you can show yours if you want, Alex, a lot of my students do elect to get this as a tattoo, because I have a very strict rule in my class that anything that is actually permanently tattooed on your body is legitimate to use during exam time, and that does not count as cheating. So very clear about this. But Freytag developed and many of you probably know this, but he developed the arc after reading everything that Shakespeare wrote and distilling that into this basic structure. So one of the questions that we asked our group of scientists was, how important is this? How do we have to use this structure exactly? And all of them said, yes, if you don't have a point where there is a conflict, if you do not have some sort of tension, it may not be between two characters. It may be between what is known and what is unknown. It may be a tension between what is and what should be. But without this piece, without this top, we don't have a story. We don't have that attention. We don't have that focusing and building that is so critical to attracting us, that burning desire to know what happens next. If we don't have this, we don't get that burning desire to know what happens next. We also know that we need vivid details, and you are all storytellers, so you know that verisimilitude is critical to having a really good and believable story. And one of the things that the scientists shared with us is that the best stories really operate just on the edge of expectation, and that there is this beautiful space between what we expect will happen and what the story brings us. And the verisimilitude helps us understand that we are operating on the safe side of that space. So Chip and Dan Heath use an example of this in their book, Made to Stick, which is a fantastic book on crafting message strategy. And when they write about stories, one of the studies that they describe is a study in which a group of research subjects are divided into two groups, of course. And in the experiment, one group was exposed to a father testifying in a courtroom in a custody hearing. And in the first group heard the father say, "I love my son so much. Every night, I get him to brush his teeth with his Darth Vader toothbrush. I tuck him into bed. I kiss him on the forehead, and I tell him I love him." The other group heard the dad say, "I love my son so much. Every night I have him brush his teeth." Uh-oh, I think I just messed it up. What did I say in the first version? Okay, thank you. Funny how that works. Okay, so in the second version, the dad said, "I love my son so much. Every night I make him brush his teeth. I tuck him in. I kiss him. I tell him I love him. And good night." So which dad was seen as being more credible? Darth Vader toothbrush, because you all remembered the Darth Vader toothbrush, and any kid who has snuck out at night and lied to her parents about where she was knows the importance of specific details to credibility of your story. Not that I have personal experience with that. But I think it's also true that when I mentioned a Darth Vader toothbrush, it occupied the visual part of your brain. And so all of you had an image in your brain of a Darth Vader toothbrush, and it doesn't matter what it looked like. It may have looked like this one. It may not have. It may have looked like something completely different, but the point is that you had that image in your brain, and I had the attention of that part of your brain. And I also hope that the next time you're in CVS buying a toothbrush, if you see a Darth Vader one, you'll think of this talk and smile. So we also know that we need really compelling characters. If stories don't have eyeballs, they're not stories. And the reason for that, of course, is empathy. We need to empathize with a central character. And I did say that stories really have to have eyeballs because compelling characters don't necessarily have to be people, right? Even in true stories, we were all deeply affected by this compelling character, right? And so part of the reason for that was that people empathized with Cecil. What was special about Cecil was he allowed people to get closer to him than most of the lions did. And so he was much more photographed. People had more images of him. So there was a deeper level of connection with Cecil. So when this happened to this particular lion, people were much more deeply affected. And concrete language. A study that was done actually at Princeton a couple of years ago studied the importance of really specific language that connects to experience and connects to imagery. So for example, one of the things that they tested is if I were to describe my friend Jaren, whom I'm quite fond, as sweet, and somebody later asked, and Olivia heard me describe Jaren as sweet, and you said, somebody later asked you, does Ann like Jaren? And you would say, you know what, Ann said Jaren is really sweet. But if I described Jaren as kind, and he is, and you were later asked what I thought of Jaren, you might say something like, I think she likes him, right? And the importance to that is that sweet connects to a particular experience. It connects to something that is highly concrete. So every single word, if you want to tell a story that people are going to remember, every single word matters. And what particularly matters is using highly concrete terms that people can relate to, in which they can see themselves. And that's one of the things that I think is also really important, is having lots of room in your story for your audience and really having enough white space in your story where people can see themselves. We were recently, a colleague and I were recently talking about storytelling and the kinds of stories that the University of Florida should be telling. And one of the things that we sort of got to was, she said, I really need to tell the UF story. And I kind of struggle with that because, of course, everybody in this room would probably agree that there is no single UF story. There is a collection of stories. But we also agreed that if we were talking to funders, probably creating a way for them to tell their own story about UF and how UF made it possible for them to achieve something that they could not otherwise do would be far more powerful than us trying to create that story. But the other thing that we talked about in our group of scientists was very emphatic about this idea of co-creating. That when we tell a story, if we don't take into account the listeners and how this story is how they're going to hear this story, how they're going to be affected by the story, what this story will mean to them, how it connects with their own experience, we've missed a significant part of it. And that gets back to the point about empathy and the direct relationship between stories and empathy. So creating that white space in your stories is a really powerful tool.
Only because Tuesday is an election and politics is team sport. I think this is the failure of modern political climate. I think on both ends, there's no space for each other in each of the major parties' political stories.
Yeah.
We can't see each other through those stories. And I think it's an interesting sort of point about creating room for your audience that as we engage ourselves in civic conversations and conversations about sort of what we feel, the future of the country should be, we often sort of tell our story very strongly with our perspective, and there's not room to play in sort of like, okay, what does that feel like, or what does that look like, or what, we can't see ourselves in the stories of the opposite side in this place like that. So I think it's an interesting point that, like, it's easy to not leave room for your audience, particularly when you feel strongly about something.
It is. I think that's a great point, and I think it's also true that when we get super disciplined about messaging and trying to tell something in great levels of detail, that we overstep, and then we crowd people out because of that. Isn't it?
We've experienced that in the water advocacy community. We've done a really good job of identifying the problems with our springs, and in the process, we've managed to alienate the agriculturalists who interpret that as a personal attack on what they're doing.
Oh,
and
interesting.
We've got to find a way to bring them back in, because there's no solution without them.
That's interesting. I never thought of this idea that a story, in being too complete, a story could almost be aggressive.
Yeah.
In that way.
And we haven't meant it that way, but that's how they've received it.
Oh, that's fascinating.
We haven't taken care to say, we need you. You have to be a part of this. We've just said, the fertilizer's the problem, the water use is the problem, and it's really built a lot of grassroots support and political support, which is what we were trying to do. But at the same time, it's been very off-putting to this one segment that's really central to any solution that we may come up with.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So creating the opportunity for all of these folks to see themselves in the story, to find their place in the story, to find their piece of the story, is critically important, not only to their attention, but in sustaining that story. This is one of the other things that came out of that conversation, is that the best stories have enough white space that they create so many more stories. And the other thing that our brains crave is something slightly different than what we say we want. And this is one of my favorite areas of exploration, is really, there are certain things that our brains think are going to happen when we start to hear a story. We have an expectation of how that story will end, but the best stories surprise us a little bit. And I didn't realize it, obviously, at the time, because this is a new insight, but one of the days that I was on Capitol Hill, I was with a woman who was from Alaska and had a child who had some really significant needs. And she had come together with a group of other parents in Alaska, because they don't have a strong social service infrastructure, to create what they called the Stone Soup Group. And so this was a support network for parents where they could begin to train each other to provide the services that the kids needed. And so we went into a meeting with one of the senior staffers from the senator from Alaska, and sat down, and she brought out a picture of her child. And the staffer said, "Oh my God, you're not going to tell me a story, are you?" And I wanted to die for this woman. I felt so terrible for her. Like, not only was she putting herself in this incredibly uncomfortable position of coming all the way from Alaska to tell her story to influential people and to bring the voices of these families to Washington, but to have her story be so diminished even before she had an opportunity to open her mouth. I was so angry. But trying to empathize with that staff person in an environment where they have 20 meetings a day in 15-minute increments. I don't even know if that math works, but you see my point. And they're hearing stories in a day, or every moment of the day. This person had story fatigue. So how do we protect against story fatigue? I think this is it. It's finding that thing that's just on the edge of what's comfortable, but still a little bit different. And I was really struggling, even yesterday we were having a conversation about how to articulate this concept. And I thought back to one of my most favorite TED Talks ever. And you've probably seen this TED Talk a million times because it's got so many views. But I thought about a particular aspect of this TED Talk in the context of story and saw it in a new way. So I wanted to share this with you. And if you haven't seen this talk, it's worth 18 minutes of your time one day while you're eating a sandwich at your desk, or have gotten up early one morning. So this is Benjamin Zander, and he's talking about how we can renew people's love or bring people to a love of classical music. So this is him talking about how we can begin to appreciate classical music. But I think as the best music does, riff on themes. I think you'll see the theme that I want you to think about here.
This is a beautiful prelude by Chopin. Some of you will know it. When I started, you thought how beautiful that sounds. I don't think we should go to the same place for our summer holidays next year. It's funny, isn't it? It's funny how those thoughts kind of waft into your head when we're together. And of course, if peace is long and you've had a long day, you might actually drift off. And then your companion will dig you in the ribs and say, "Wake up, it's culture!" And then you feel even worse. Has it ever occurred to you that the reason you feel sleepy in classical music is not because of you, but because of us? Did anybody think while I was playing, why is he using so many impulses? If I'd done this with my head, you certainly would have thought it. Every time you hear classical music, you'll always be able to know if you hear those impulses. So let's see what's really going on here. We have a B. This is a B. The next note is a C. And the job of the C is to make the B sad. And it does, doesn't it? Composers know that. If they want sad music, they just play those two notes. But basically, it's just a B with four sads. Now it goes down to A, now to G, and then to F. So we have B, A, G, F. And if we have B, A, G, F, what do we expect next? Ooh, that might have been a fluke. Let's try it again. Ooh, the 10 choir. And you notice nobody is toned deaf. Nobody's, every village in Bangladesh and every hamlet in China, everybody knows. Da, 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 da. Everybody knows who's expecting that E. Now, Chopin didn't want to reach the E there, because what will have happened? It'll be over, like Hamlet. You remember Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3, he finds out that his uncle killed his father. You remember he keeps on going up to his uncle and almost killing him. And then he backs away, and then he goes up to him again, and almost kills him. And the critics, all of whom sitting in the back row there, they have to have an opinion, so they say Hamlet is a procrastinator. Or they say Hamlet has an Oedipus complex. No, otherwise the play would be over, stupid. That's why Shakespeare puts all that stuff in Hamlet, Ophelia going mad, and playing with the play, and Yorick's skull, and the grave diggers. That's in order to delay until Act 5 you can kill him. It's the same with the Chopin. He's just about to reach the E, and he says, "Oops, better go back up and do it again." So he does it again. Now he gets excited. That's exciting, you don't have to worry about it. Now he gets excited. Finally he goes down to E. But it's the wrong chord. Because the chord he's looking for is this one. It says he does. Now we call that a deceptive cadence. Because it deceives us. I always tell my students, if you have a deceptive cadence, be sure to raise your eyebrows, then everybody will know. Again. That chord doesn't work. Now he tries E again. That chord doesn't work. Now he tries E again. That doesn't work. And then finally, it's the gentleman in the front row who went. Same gesture he makes when he comes home.
So I love that as an example of the structure of a great story. And I had never thought about it that way, even though I've seen this talk dozens and dozens of times. But in thinking through this idea of operating just at the edge of expectation being what makes a story great, And I saw this again, and I thought, that's exactly what he's describing when he's describing this journey that Chopin takes up the keyboard and continuing to give us chords that are not what we expect, right? That's what stories do, is they play a song for us that has notes that we don't expect over and over, and we're desperate for that resolution. You heard the audience sing the note that they were craving, right? That's the thing, is that we want that resolution. We finally get to that resolution. That is the denouement, right? But seeing it this way made me think about it differently. And so when you are telling stories, when you're creating stories, whether your stories are true or fictional, you have to find your own deceptive cadences in those stories. And I use this image behind it because I was thinking about our friend who studies horror films and his description of Jaws, and how and I started to think about all of the different deceptive cadences that we see in Jaws, and that it's so long in that film before we even see the shark, right? And we have all of these moments where we keep thinking that we're going to see it. So I would say that that's something that our brains crave that we could never articulate. So putting all of this together, I want to take a moment and think about how we could take stories that we tell all the time. We all have our own sacred bundle of stories that are stories that we tell about why I moved to Florida, or how I met my loved one, or that time I totally humiliated myself and didn't die. We all have these stories, right? And so I want you to take a moment and think about a story that you tell all the time at cocktail parties, the story of how the nonprofit that you founded, where it came from, the story about how somebody influenced you. I want you to bring to mind a story that you have told so many times. I could wake you up from a sound sleep and you would tell me this story. So my story like that happened one Christmas when I was, oh my goodness, I think I was 5. And my grandfather had had a heart attack. And so we were visiting him in the hospital every single night. And my poor parents, both of them were working. My dad was working 2 jobs. My mom was threatened with losing her dad during the holidays. And so we were at the hospital every night. And this was hard for me to understand. I didn't really understand his illness. I didn't understand what was happening. But I did understand that it was Christmas time and our living room was empty. We did not have a Christmas tree. And every night, my parents would come home from work. We'd go see Grandpa. We'd drive home. It would be 9:30 at night. And I would say, can we please get a tree tonight? And they're like, we'll get it tomorrow. We were visiting my grandpa on Christmas Eve, and I said, could tonight please be the night that we get our Christmas tree? And my dad looked at me and said, okay, tonight's the night. You're right, we should have a tree. So this is just outside of Chicago. And so there we are, we're driving around Chicago. I'm wedged in the back seat between my older brother and my older sister. And okay, we're getting the tree. Everything is gonna be okay. So we go to the first Christmas tree lot, and it's closed. Okay, no big deal. Go to the next one. Closed. Go to the next one. Closed. I am starting to seriously freak out because I know the deal. If there's no tree, there's no Santa, there's no presents, there's no Christmas. That's the deal. I am aware of this. I know how it works. So I'm seriously starting to freak out, and I start to lose my mind. My dad, having a 5-year-old little girl in the backseat of his car, sees a policeman and pulls up next to him. And he says, do you know where there's a Christmas tree place open? And the policeman says, oh yeah, did you try the one over here? Yeah, we've been there. Did you try the one over here? Yeah, we tried that one too. We've been. So he lists all the ones that he knows. We've been to all of them. They are all closed. And as it happens at that moment, we are next to a closed Christmas tree place. And the policeman says, wait right here. And he grabs the top of the chain link fence, throws one leg over, throws the other leg over, jumps down on the other side, and the next thing we see is a Christmas tree coming back over the fence. He hands it to my dad, they tie it to the top of the car, and we get home, and I'm like, yes, Christmas is saying we're going to have a Christmas tree. Let's get this thing in the stand. Let's get this thing decorated. My dad puts it in the stand. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, there's a reason this Christmas tree was still available on Christmas Eve. Let me tell you, this thing was like 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide. It was hideous. It was a bush. And my mom looked at this tree and she said, you know, I'm not happy with the tree. And my dad's like, you're kidding me, right? It's Christmas Eve. It's quite late, midnight at this point. And I'm like, let's get the boxes, let's get the lights, let's get this show on the road. I hear sleigh bells like, we are losing time, people. But no, my mom sent my dad out to steal another Christmas tree. So he gets back at 2 o'clock in the morning with the tallest, skinniest Christmas tree you have ever seen. And this Christmas tree has got gaps in it that are like this big. And I'm like, okay, let's go, let's do this. And my mom's like, you know, if we could just maybe like put the two of them together. So my dad sighed deeply and went out on the back porch in practically 0-degree weather with a roll of duct tape and a saw. Came back in, got the tree in the stand, we decorated it, I got in bed. The next morning, I was up very early, the tree was decorated, there were gifts under it. It was the most beautiful Christmas tree you have ever seen, except for the one that we had the following year, which was, of course, plastic. And from that point on, we always had plastic Christmas trees. So this is a story that I have told all my life. We obviously tell this story every Christmas in my family. Everybody has a slightly different version of it. But now that I have thought about this, the science of storytelling, I tell the story differently than I used to. And because I want it to be a more interesting story. I want it to be a better story. Every detail of the story is still true. Everything that I told you still happened. But I had not previously considered how important it was that it was duct tape, like the visual detail of duct tape. I had not previously considered the importance of including my emotion as a kid, not just my anxiety, but the fact that I was really, truly losing my mind in the backseat of that car. And really thinking about who in that story my audience might be co-creating with. Because I had always thought in telling that story that people were co-creating with me. Of course, it's like my story. But no, they were thinking about my parents and how difficult it must have been for them to deal with the pressures of the holidays and getting a family ready for the holidays when they were facing such a serious family crisis, let alone whatever family crisis had my father working 2 jobs and my mother also working at a time when a few women in her social circle did. And so because of this, I tell the story very differently. So I want you to take a moment, because we have a few more minutes left. I want you to take a moment and think about a story that you've told several times. And if you're okay with it, I'd love for you to share that story with us now and maybe tell it in a different way.
So this is interesting because the story I was going to share is a part of the keynote today, and I'm sitting here like, man, I'm just throwing everything out the window. This is different. Like, you can really change what the next 45 minutes. But there's a story I shared previously within education track. I was talking about my grandfather. So I think I can retell that for those who heard it. Also get to hear it. My grandfather was a town alderman and the mayor pro tem. So if anything happens to the mayor, he was the next guy in line. And I was young when I saw my grandfather, and I found later on in life that all of my cousins, and I don't know what y'all saw, my cousins are brothers and sisters, we saw my grandfather after the revolution happened for him. We didn't know the stories of our parents or the experience, the drug and alcohol and domestic abuse. We saw the other side once he became the man he always knew he was and was in the space that he could do that for the community. And wrap it up. Okay, we're good. Right. So when I was little, I used to ride with him in the morning. He had this big yellow long car, and it was long. I swear, it felt like it was in this room. When you're this tall, pretty wide, you know. And so we're in this car, and every morning on the weekends, he would get up at the crack of dawn, and we would ride to go get coffee and cheese biscuits. And these cheese biscuits were huge. Like, they looked like balls of very little bread and a lot of cheese. I remember my grandmother pulling apart the cheese. She did it coffee. Those rides, I didn't understand how important they would be in terms of the rest of my life. There was one lesson that we stopped to get a cheese biscuit one morning. There was a store. The store was a little dirtier than usual. It was a corner store, cash and carry. That's some of the cheese biscuits. And my grandfather took one of the brooms and helped the store owner sweep the store. And I didn't understand why, because sometimes the store owner was very rude at times to my grandfather. And when we got to the car, I'm like 6 or 7, so, no matter what it is that you're doing, no matter who you're working with or whatever space you're in, you always want to leave that space better when you leave it than what it was when you got here. And if you do that, you'll form a community and you'll make the world better. So I'm still upset that he's doing it for this guy who's rude to us a lot of the time. We buy your cheese biscuits every Saturday, you know. But I found myself doing that. That's the one ride that I'll always remember. He taught me how to change the oil. The time he told me to make the world better than before he got there. So, I tried to do that with everything that I do. Previously, I told that story, and I was just talking about the sweeping of it all. And hearing this, I'm like, the cheese biscuits, you know, the long car. Like, these are the things that I remember when I think about that memory. I see it flashing in my face. So, thank you for sharing that, because it changes that inheritance and how you tell stories.
And thank you for telling that story and for taking that risk as well. So I struggled a little bit with sort of why this particular talk belonged in the education track, and I was reflecting on that this morning as I was driving here. And at first I think, well, it belongs here because obviously everything that we know about stories comes from, all of this scholarship comes from academia, so obviously it belongs here. But I was thinking, no, as educators, if we want people to remember what we teach them, we have to teach in the form of stories. But we also are required to help our students become great storytellers too. And that if they are not great storytellers, then they're not going to achieve their potential. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for being part of this session, and thank you so much for letting me be here.